This is something that actually happened to me in Chicago. I've changed a couple names for legal reasons, but every feeling, bruise, and document is real. The betrayal started in a glass-walled conference room on the 27th floor, under the humming buzz of recessed LEDs and the smell of burnt espresso from a Jura machine that never worked right. We were gathered for the Lakeshore Hart, quarterly all hands, hands pressed to phones, eyes on the skyline, a dozen VPs lined like statues behind a polished walnut table where a crystal top producer award waited. Colin, my then boyfriend, was supposed to receive it. He kissed me on the cheek in front of everyone, then took the plaque, tapped the microphone, and thanked the person who made it all possible, and turned to the junior analyst he'd been sleeping with for months. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. When I say I tasted pennies, I mean it. The metallic rush hit my tongue as heads turned, some pitying, others bright with the tabloid thrill people get when it isn't their life collapsing. The analyst was named Daphne, 24, a banking refugee with neat braids and a laugh I'd come to loathe. She stood too fast, bumping her chair into the glass and leaving a smear that would stay until housekeeping came after hours. Colin wrapped an arm around her shoulders and gave me the almost sorry smile he saved for when he knew he'd gone too far, but liked the audience too much to retreat. The Chicago River lay below us, jade and indifferent. No one said anything. Lakeshore Hart was that kind of place, quiet when it mattered, loud when it didn't. The company made its money by dressing up debt like it was a picnic. Real estate syndications, capital stacks, creative structures that meant we got our fees first. I'd been hired as a senior ops manager, budgets, compliance, software rollouts, none of the sexy revenue stuff that got Colin on emails to the CEO at midnight. But I knew where everything lived. Contracts, approval chains, the skeletons in each department's shared drive. It was my job to make sure the trains ran and the sparks didn't catch the curtains. Colin and I met a summer earlier at the Violet Hour in Wicker Park. He ordered a Sazerac and said something about how bars without televisions were sacred, and I was tired of shouting over Cubs games to men who never listened past the second sentence. He was pretty in a way that photographs forgive. Sharp jaw, careful stubble, the right shoes. He talked about books he hadn't read and places he hadn't been with such enthusiasm I mistook it for a future. The first time he stayed over, he folded my dish towel the way my grandmother did, triangular over the oven bar. It felt like a sign. He had rules. He said them like jokes. Don't text after midnight. He kept sleep boundaries. Don't ask about client dinners. Trust is sexy. Don't smoke on the balcony. Image matters. Neighbors talk. If I met those rules, he met me at my best. Forehead kisses, good coffee, morning runs on the lakefront trail that ended with him spinning me under the concrete ribs of the North Avenue pedestrian bridge. He was careful about optics at work. We wrote separate Ubers to team drinks and never left together. If you've ever wondered why women go along with men like that, I'll tell you, because we're taught to admire competence and confuse it with character. The day of the all hands, he'd asked me not to sit near him. Distraction, he said, but he winked. I took a seat behind the finance VP, a woman whose contempt came wrapped in silk scarves. Lakeshore Hart glowed frosted on the glass behind the walnut table. Hart larger than Lakeshore, a private joke everyone made in the elevators because Richard Hart, co-founder and CEO, outshone his dead partner by a factor of 10. Richard was late that morning. In his absence, Colin played ringmaster. He thanked the extra hours Daphne had put in and let the room connect whatever dots it wanted. He always understood people rushed to write someone else's story if you left the outlines clean. After, in the hallway smelling like lemon cleaner and printer toner, he pulled me into a false private corner. "Don't make a scene," he said, voice low. eyes glittering with the energy he got from any audience, even a hostile one. We weren't ever going to work long-term, babe. You know that. He'd said versions of it before. He was older by 7 years and wore his experience like a medal and an excuse. You're intense, he'd sometimes say. You overthink. When he was generous. You'll go far once you smooth out the edges. When he was cruel. You're lucky to be with someone like me who can handle you. He looked down the hall, as if bored already. We can be adults about this. It's not personal. The humiliation didn't stop there. The award emails circulated within minutes. Congrats to Colin Mercer and Daphne Patel for setting a new quarterly record. The ampersand was a stab. The photograph, taken without me noticing, showed Daphne's hair catching the light and my face in the reflection of the conference room glass, small and stunned like I'd been pasted in later. I took the elevator to the lobby because you learn in a building like that never to cry on the floor where you're paid. I walked to the river and leaned over the rail like Detective Benson receiving hard news. The wind off the water grabbed my hair. I called my sister in San Diego, who said what sisters say, I'll murder him, and you're better than this, and tickets are cheap, come sleep on my couch. I told her I needed to be the one who left, not the one who fled. That night, he texted twice. The second one said, you were always going to make this hard. We're just in different leagues. Please don't embarrass me at work. The please was a jewel on a knife. I typed and erased a dozen replies. I wanted to say, you're a parasite. I wanted to say, your touch felt like being erased in slow motion. I wrote nothing. The next morning, HR sent me an email. Let us know if you'd like to talk to someone. They were afraid I'd file something messy. I hovered over the reply box. Lakeshore Hart had a handbook that said consensual relationships needed to be disclosed. Colin had disclosed nothing, but I could already see how it would go. I'd be the one moved off projects because optics, and he'd be counseled on mindfulness and given a workshop on bias. I went into the office anyway. I needed something more than righteous indignation. I brought a paper notebook because typing my fury felt vulgar. I sat at my desk, a corner with a sliver of view over Michigan Avenue if I leaned, and read the month's compliance exception reports. That's where the bodies are. A vendor paid twice here, a wire rerouted there, a contract signed out of sequence. The kind of incidents that look like rounding errors but tell you who the company lets bend rules. At noon, I walked to the Publican for oysters alone because I needed a ritual to mark before and after. I watched people laugh over Belgian beer and thought, this is how scandals die, absorbed into appetite, digested into anecdotes. On my way back, I stopped at the Walgreens on State to buy eye drops because pride looks better hydrated. Around 3, an email came across my screen from legal, CCing me as a courtesy. The subject, Horizon Tower, vendor approval. Horizon Tower was a development in the West Loop we had our fingers in up to the elbow. The email thread was long and, like most legal threads, both boring and revealing. A new vendor, LakeMart Solutions, had been added to a master services agreement for site security and logistics, approved retroactively, which should never happen. The number was small enough to avoid board scrutiny, large enough to matter, $78,400 monthly for 9 months. I didn't recognize the vendor. I clicked the attachment. The signature looked familiar in a laugh-at-funerals way, like a face you've seen distorted in a funhouse mirror. The signee, Colin Mercer, as acting director, Horizon Partnerships, not his title. He'd skipped 2 approvals and gotten legal to bless it post hoc due to project urgency. He'd written to the CFO, we had a verbal from Rick, meaning Richard Hart. The CFO had replied, noted, please make sure the doc packet is complete for audit. LakeMart Solutions had a Gmail domain on its invoice. Red flag 1. Its address was a mailbox in a UPS store on Clark Street. Red flag 2. The contact number went straight to voicemail. a smooth female voice that sounded like AI. Red flag 3. I Googled and got nothing but a splash page with stock photos of smiling security guards and a misspelled mission statement promising seamless site safety. The site had been created a week earlier. If a lie could wear new car cologne, this was it. I'd been with Colin long enough to know his ambition liked shortcuts. He hated the grind of process. He called it administrivia, like the word itself was beneath him. He liked outcomes he could brag about over old fashions. If he'd found a way to siphon money into a shell, would I be surprised? No. Would I be the idiot who let humiliation be the end of my story? Also, no. I printed the contract packet and the invoices, slid them into a blue folder, and walked down 2 floors to IT. The manager there, Jada, owed me a favor for fast-tracking her team's software licenses when the budget was a mess. Jada was blunt, brilliant, and allergic to drama. My favorite kind of colleague. I asked her if she could pull metadata on emails related to LakeMart Solutions, headers, origination IPs, server logs. She raised an eyebrow. Phishing? Compliance review, I said, which, coming from me, wasn't a lie. She asked for a ticket number. I gave her the legal threads reference code and the CFO CC. I'll see what I can do, she said. If it turns into something, I want popcorn. That night, I didn't go home. Home smelled like him. I booked a room at the Hotel Julian on Michigan Avenue because I once swore I'd sleep with that view when my heart broke. I ate a chopped salad from Sweet Green like a woman in a commercial about self-care and stared at the gray-blue lake until it turned black. I read until I stopped rereading the same line and finally slept at 3 a.m., clutching the blue folder against my stomach like a hot water bottle. In the morning, my phone had 3 messages from unknown numbers. The first was a hang-up. The second was heavy breathing, the kind of cliche that only cowards and 13-year-old pranksters use. The third was a text. Drop it. Wrong tree to bark up. Green bubble. No contact name. The punctuation, none, told me whoever sent it didn't worry about grammar, only impact. I showered, dressed, and walked to work along the Riverwalk, watching runners with bright shoes and labradoodles that didn't understand leashes. I almost turned back twice. Revenge stories make courage sound like a switch you flip, but it's really a dimmer. It moves in increments you barely notice until the room is bright enough to see what you're doing. When I reached my desk, Jada had sent a message. "You didn't get this from me." LakeMart domain, registered from an IP that also accessed our guest Wi-Fi last Tuesday. Device name Mercer MBP. Also, 3 invoices were uploaded from a Starbucks on LaSalle. I pulled the timestamps. You'll laugh. She attached a CSV. I didn't laugh. The timestamps overlapped with a meeting I'd been in with Colin at that exact Starbucks. He'd stepped out, said he had to take a call from a difficult Dallas investor, and came back smug like he'd tamed a feral pony. I remembered his hand on my knee under the table, as if possession were apology. I walked the blue folder to legal and asked an associate I trusted, a woman named Priya, who wore soft cardigans and carried a quiet steel that made partners flinch if she'd seen the LakeMart approval history. She had. "Many things happen here that happen nowhere else," she said gently. "Do you want advice as a colleague or as a friend?" "Both." As a colleague, don't put yourself in the path of a moving train without first mapping the tracks. As a friend, if this touches heart, document everything. If it touches only Mercer, swing. I spent the afternoon doing what I do best, quietly making myself dangerous. I printed everything. I saved files to an encrypted thumb drive I bought from the Apple Store at the top of the hour, so the receipt timestamp would corroborate. I asked innocuous questions in plain channels. "Hey, ops here. Can anyone point me to the vendor onboarding checklist for Horizon? Want to make sure we're tidy for audit?" Smiley face. People answered with emojis and PDFs they wouldn't remember sending. I learned that the only person who had insisted on expedited vendor onboarding for LakeMart was Colin. He had written, "This comes from Rick. Don't hold it up." At 6 p.m., I decided to go home. I couldn't live in exile from my own dresser forever, and the apartment in Old Town we'd shared felt like a museum of someone else's taste. His taste. Dark wood, gray textiles, coffee table books about mid-century designers whose names he pronounced like he'd met them. I opened the windows to scrape the air. I made tea and didn't drink it. I stood in the doorway of the bedroom like a guest. That's when I heard the key. He didn't knock. Of course he didn't. He walked in like a man whose story had never been interrupted. He wore his navy suit. His tie was loose in that calculated way that suggests exhaustion and vigor at once. "Hey," he said, like we'd made plans. "This is my lease," I said. He smirked. "It's a shared lease." I nodded toward the stack of boxes by the door. I'd labeled them with blue painter's tape. His books, his shoes, his framed copy of a New Yorker cover he'd once described as aspirational. "Your things are ready." He looked around, slow, a cat inspecting a birdcage. "You're not going to do anything stupid, right?" he said. "About work? About Daphne? You'll land on your feet. You always do. You're resourceful." He said it like a flaw. "I know about LakeMart," I said. For the first time since I'd met him, something true cracked through his face. Not fear, not yet. Calculation. He stood still, assessing angles, then smiled like I'd said I knew about Santa. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "I have logs," I said. "Metadata, invoices, IPs, Starbucks, your device name." He tilted his head. "Careful," he said. "You're making a lot of assumptions. Defamation is expensive." "Not if it's true." "And what would you do exactly?" he said, amused again. "March into Hart's office waving your blue folder? He's not going to choose some operations manager over me. I bring in money. You file purchase orders. He likes money. We all like money." "You used his name in emails," I said. "If he didn't approve it, you lied. If he did, you implicated him. Tell me which story you want me to believe." He walked closer. "You don't have the stomach for this," he said, soft. "You never did. You like plans, lists, rules. This is a knife fight. I'll cut you in ways you won't see coming. And when I'm done, you'll thank me for keeping it clean." He reached for one of the boxes, then paused, fingers flattening over the blue tape. "You won't move on," he added, almost tenderly. "You're not built for it." He took his framed New Yorker and left. The door snicked shut with that gentle click that means the seal is working properly. I stood in the quiet and felt my future rearrange its furniture. An hour later, my phone buzzed. Unknown number again. This time it was a voice I recognized from earnings calls and hallway silences. Richard Hart, the man whose name loomed in frosted glass behind every meeting we held. "Ms. Clark," he said, my last name mispronounced in that Lakeshore driveway that turns short vowels long. "I hear you've been asking about Horizon's vendor stack. Come to my office at 8 tomorrow. Bring whatever you have. And Ms. Clark, don't forward anything else tonight. Use your judgment." The line went dead. I stared at the city lights like they were a language I was just starting to read. I picked up the blue folder. I thought about a crystal plaque and a microphone and a kiss delivered like a verdict. I thought about how men like Colin count on women like me to go quiet. At 8 tomorrow, I would walk into the office of the man who could crush me with a single email, or change the trajectory of both our lives. Richard Hart's office had a way of making you feel like you were trespassing in your own city. It wasn't even the view, the river burnishing toward the lake like a wrist turning over, or the 3 abstract canvases that probably cost a junior analyst's annual salary. It was the quiet, the kind of quiet you only get when people are too busy making money to fill silences with talk. He didn't ask me to sit. He watched how I chose the chair and whether I flinched at the scrape of its leg against the floor. "Ms. Clark," he said, and when I corrected the vowel in my last name, he nodded like he was checking a box that said, "Pays attention." I set the blue folder on the table and opened it to the top sheet. I didn't lead with the part about my ex. I led with what mattered to him. Risk, liability, the surest path from now to uncontaminated. I showed him how LakeMart Solutions had been onboarded against policy. I showed him invoices routed from public Wi-Fi and a MacBook whose device name wore the man's last name like a vanity plate. I showed him the Gmail domain, the UPS mailbox, the misspelled mission statement, the call to Rick made in writing without him on CC. I laid out the thing as I'd learned to do. Spare, clean, indignant only in its precision. He didn't touch the papers, he touched the table. Fingertips to wood, as if feeling for a heartbeat. You realize, he said, that if you're wrong, you've accused one of my highest-earning producers of committing fraud. I realize, I said. If I were guessing, I'd be quieter. He let another few seconds pass, then pressed a button on his phone. Mary, bring in Mr. Sloan. Mr. Sloan was our outside counsel. Gray hair so sharp it was almost blue, a suit that fit like a secret. He took my folder and began reading while I watched the way his wrists angled at the hinge, the way he made piles. Relevant, irrelevant, dangerous, dynamite. When he finished, he asked me 2 questions. Who else have you told? And are you prepared to have your life be about this for a while? It's manager Jada, legal's associate Priya, and yes. He smiled at the second answer. You say yes now, he said. The middle of these things is worse than the end. Richard leaned back. Freeze all payments to LakeMart, he said to Sloan. Quietly, I want a forensic team inside by noon. Pull the security footage from the Starbucks on LaSalle for the timestamps she highlighted and the access logs for the guest Wi-Fi. And get me the audit committee. I'll tell them we have a potential vendor fraud matter that may involve an internal actor. He turned to me. You're on leave, he said. Paid. Use this office as needed. But you're not to email or call anyone internally who's not Sloan or me. You'll have an encrypted drive and a burner number by 10. And Ms. Clark, if anyone threatens you, you'll call me before you call the police. The police will get their turn, but first, we'll make sure we give them something worthy of their attention. I went home and waited. The waiting he hadn't warned me about. It's a specific weather, the barometric pressure of every hour pressed into your lungs. Men like Colin Bank on people not having the stamina to sit in that weather. At 1 p.m., Jada texted a single popcorn emoji and then a thumbs down. He'd been in the office all morning, pacing, whispering, Daphne hovering like a sparrow that kept flying into a window. At 2:17 p.m., Priya called and said the audit committee had engaged a second outside firm to triangulate facts so nobody could accuse anyone of agenda. At 4:09 p.m., Sloan sent me a short message. Got the Starbucks footage. He stepped outside at 11:12 a.m., returned at 11:27 holding a manila that matches the invoice packet. We have your timestamp. We have your man. They didn't call him into HR that day. Richard liked to choose his weather, too. Instead, he sent one email company-wide at 8:03 p.m. from his iPhone. As we continue to grow, we must renew our commitment to diligence and ethics. This week, we're executing a routine review of vendor protocols. Please cooperate fully with any request from legal or IT. 4 sentences that said nothing and promised fire. The next morning, I witnessed the first small crack from the outside. A wire to LakeMart bounced. A bank, alerted by Sloan, asked for updated W-9s and proof of services rendered. The email landed in the shared inbox where accounts payable lived, and because AP was run by a woman named Lorraine who wore bifocals on a gold chain and ironed her slacks, she printed it, highlighted it, and marched it down the hall to Daphne. Mr. Mercer asked us to root these, she said, holding the paper like a priest holds a wafer. Daphne, who had not done anything illegal yet, looked at the wobbling letters of a bank name and regretted the shape of her ambition. I don't know what she thought would happen when she said, "Let me run it by Colin." What happened was me, A minute later, receiving a text from an unknown number that said, "He knows. He's cornered. Be careful." Richard didn't want careful. He wanted decisive. At 11, he had me sit in on a call with the forensic firm from a small conference room whose blinds never closed evenly. They explained what they'd found in the first 24 hours. The domain registration linked to an email tied to a burner that pinged one of two towers, the one near Colin's high-rise, the one near the office. A laptop with his device name connecting to LakeMart's back end, an IP collision between a test portal for a different vendor and LakeMart's invoice system from an apartment in Old Town, the apartment I had just aired out. "We won't get bank wires without subpoenas," the firm's lead said, "but we can walk a state's attorney right to the waterline." Richard's silence grew like a shadow. "Do it," he said finally, "and prepare a memo to the board. Mr. Mercer is to be on leave immediately. Badge access removed at 5. At 4:13 p.m., the glass on our floor's elevator lobby doubled as a mirror for a show I had paid for in humiliation. Colin strode forward, and 3 people stood up without realizing they had. He reached for his badge, and the light stayed red. He swiped again, smiled as if the thing were coy, and turned when a security guard I didn't know but instantly loved said, "Mr. Mercer, would you come with me?" They took him to a room without windows. HR was there, 2 of them, never one, and Sloan and Richard, who insisted on being the person who did the thing that needed doing if he'd signed the email that made it inevitable. They didn't let me in. That would have been petty. They let me stand across the hall and listen to the murmur and one raised voice, his, and the soft refusal of a woman saying, "That's not accurate," the way women do when accuracy is the only weapon they trust. 20 minutes later, he walked out with a small box and a face arranged for pity. That's where I learned something important. Some men can only hold one expression, and when you stop believing it, it slides right off. He didn't see me, or he did and refused me the dignity of acknowledgement. What he gave me instead, as he passed within 3 feet, was that hissed half-whisper he used when he wanted to scare me in ways I wouldn't admit out loud. "You'll never move on," he said. "You'll make this your whole personality." He left the building into a sky that had decided on rain and didn't care who had an umbrella. I went into the room they'd used and sat in his chair. It was warm. I waited until it cooled. The law moved like winter sun, low and steady. Sloan handed off to a white-collar unit that met in a beige conference room at the Cook County State's Attorney's Office and asked me the same questions 3 ways. We turned over the blue folder, then a thicker one, then something that had to be bound with those black plastic spines I hadn't seen since grad school. I learned a new vocabulary: predicate acts, enrichment, mail fraud, wire fraud, scheme, intent. They didn't need me to be the star. They needed me to be a metronome. This happened, then this, then this. I kept time. Daphne, to her credit, cooperated. She didn't know. She hadn't signed anything besides a cover sheet he said was for a courier. She cried in a way that made me see 2 things at once: her youth and my former stupidity. When she asked to meet with me privately, I said yes, and we sat in the coffee shop in the lobby of the Langham, while rain made our reflections blur together on the glass. "I'm sorry," she said. "He said you were difficult. He said you had moved on already." I told her what I wish someone had told me at 24, that difficulty is a compliment when it comes from a man who needs you to be easy to get away with what he wants. The company moved like a wounded animal that refuses to limp. Richard had an all-hands in the same glass-walled conference room where my life had bifurcated. He said "we" and values and thresholds and accountability and never said Colin's name. It wasn't cowardice. It was lawsuit management. But afterward, he pulled me into his office and closed the door and said mine. "You did the thing people don't do until their life is already on fire," he said. "You turned around early." He was not a soft man. He was a precise one. In those weeks, in the measured phone calls and midnight emails, in the meetings where his jaw worked, like he was chewing something he couldn't swallow, I learned what his wife's obituary could not hold, how grief had sutured him into his routines, how he hated liars because he'd believed one once and watched it cost him days he couldn't get back, how he loved this city, not as a postcard, but as a schedule, bridges up and down, trains that scream, Lake Michigan pretending to be a sea. We didn't flirt. We didn't do anything that would make me a story someone else told over drinks. We worked. Charges took a while. They always do. When the knock came on his door in the early afternoon of a Wednesday in June, it came with men whose belts carry radios and whose eyes don't change when you call them names. He didn't call me. I read about it on the Sun-Times site in a paragraph that misspelled mine. Former executive accused, it said, and the mugshot had the same hair as the headshots he'd used to sell people a version of himself that wore a better suit. Wire fraud, bank fraud, theft by deception. He pled not guilty. Of course he did. Men like him only plead when they run out of ways to ruin the air. We didn't celebrate. We took a breath. In that breath, Richard did something I hadn't expected. He offered me a job that scared me the way a clean horizon scares someone who's only ever sailed near the shore. Interim director of operations, he said, and then we'll make it permanent if you don't set the place on fire in 6 months. The office I inherited had a view that might as well have been CGI compared to the sliver I used to lean for. I moved my stapler into it like a talisman. I left his crystal top producer plaque face down on the shelf for a week, then asked facilities to donate it to a high school for mock trophies. I hung nothing on the wall until the day I realized I'd stopped standing in doorways like a guest. Then I put up a map of Chicago with push pins where our projects lived like little beating hearts. You want to know when Richard and I became not just a CEO and the woman who made his trains run, but something else. It didn't happen at work. It couldn't. We are both too good at process to confuse it with longing. It happened on a Sunday morning in late October. At the farmer's market in Logan Square, I was standing in front of a stand whose apples looked like they'd been buffed by angels, holding a bag in one hand and a coffee in the other, when a gust of jacket-cold wind made me spill. He appeared like he had been intended to stand in that exact spot, holding napkins and a smile the way Midwesterners are born, knowing how to do. "You're early," he said, and only later did I realize we'd never told each other where we'd be. We dated the way adults do when they've already lost things. He had grown children who approved not because I was their mother's replacement, I would never be, but because I made him laugh at the parts of himself that needed it. I was cautious, and then I wasn't. We kept our own rules. One of them was that I would not report to him. So when our first kiss turned into a plan, I resigned. I consulted for a year, took on a messy hospital rollout in Hyde Park that I still brag about when I drink too much bourbon, and watched Lakeshore Hart from across the river, proud and a little hungry. We married at the Chicago Athletic Association, under the carved beams and stained glass that make you feel like a late-breaking royal. Small, private, winter, because winter makes promises feel more intentional. The clerk at the Cook County building didn't blink at our names, our ages, our faces. A few people whispered about it the way people always will, but the whisper ran out of breath sooner than they expected. We honeymooned in Door County instead of Greece because we liked the way Lake Michigan pretends to be the thing it isn't. When Richard asked if I'd come back, we did it clean. I became chief operating officer with the board's vote and an HR memo that used more words than any love letter I've ever received. On my first day, I stood in a different office, the one that had belonged to the man who said I wouldn't move on. The facilities crew had repainted. They'd replaced the chairs so nobody had to smell the ghost of his cologne. I put my blue folder in the bottom drawer. not because I needed it, but because rituals matter. I moved the stapler to the corner where he had once kept a framed cartoon about hard work. I opened the blinds and let the LEDs hum. He sent me one letter from prison. I half expected he'd call it a camp. He didn't. He used the right word for once. The letter wasn't apology. It was a list of grievances against the system and a reminder that he'd introduced me to the violet hour, like he believed he'd invented cocktails. I read it at my desk in the office I'd taken from him and then put it back in the blue folder and shut the drawer. No reply. Daphne texted me on a random Tuesday to say she'd been accepted to grad school. Public policy, she wrote, like a person who has decided she wants to be useful. I sent 4 exclamation points and offered to be a reference, not because I owed it to her, but because the universe is messy, and sometimes the smallest piece of grace is the lever that moves you past the worst version of yourself. People always ask, if marrying my former boss changes the way this story feels in my mouth when I tell it. They want to know if I planned it, like the revenge wasn't the justice, but the ring. I tell them the truth, which is the only version I have patience for now. He is my husband because he stood next to me in a storm without asking if I'd packed an umbrella, and the storms before taught me how to look up. The office I took wasn't a trophy. It was a seat at the table where my nameplate looks as inevitable as the skyline. The moving on he swore I'd never do turned out to be a series of small, stubborn steps that landed me on a rug I chose, in a room I earned, with a man who keeps coffee in the kitchen that actually tastes like coffee. Sometimes, late, when the building's bones creak and the river looks like a highway of light, I open the bottom drawer and touch the blue folder. It's thinner than it used to be. If you press your palms to it, you can feel very faintly the heat that used to be his. That's not why I keep it. I keep it to remind myself that there are rooms where the quiet isn't indifference. It's attention collecting itself into consequence. In this office, with the LEDs humming and the city leaning its shoulder against the glass, I've learned to love that quiet. It's the sound of my life, finally belonging to me. The end